On a freezing Boston morning, a millionaire noticed a 5-year-old girl standing outside his restaurant, clutching a crying baby in trembling arms. When he asked where her family was, the little girl whispered a sentence that froze him in place. "Our guardian says we're worth more when we stay quiet." Boston woke slowly that October morning, wrapped in the pale gold light of early autumn. The streets of Beacon Row moved with quiet confidence, polished shoes crossing clean sidewalks, the soft murmur of morning commuters, and the distant hum of taxis gliding through the crisp air. At the corner stood Valorian, a restaurant known for understated elegance. Inside, warm amber light glowed through tall glass windows. Linen tablecloths were pressed perfectly smooth. Crystal glasses caught the sunlight and scattered it across the polished floor like tiny fragments of gold. It was a place where wealth rarely needed to announce itself, but outside those glowing windows stood something the restaurant had never expected. A little girl. Wren Holloway was only 5 years old, though the thinness in her cheeks and the stillness in her eyes made her look smaller. Her brown sweater hung loosely over narrow shoulders, and the sleeves were pushed down past her wrists, as if she had learned to hide something there. In her arms, she held a baby. Ivy, 8 months old, was wrapped in a faded blanket that had once been pink but had long since surrendered its color to time and cold weather. The baby whimpered weakly against Wren's chest, her tiny hands clutching the edge of the blanket. Wren rocked gently from heel to heel. "I'm here," she whispered softly, pressing her cheek against Ivy's head. People passed by on the sidewalk. A woman slowed for half a second, curiosity flickering in her eyes before she looked away. A businessman pretended to check his phone. 2 college students glanced over their shoulders, then continued walking. No one stopped. The world had mastered a particular skill, looking without truly seeing. Wren did not ask them for help. She had tried that before. Across the street, a black car door opened quietly, and the man stepping out of it was about to notice the one thing the rest of the city had missed. The door of the black sedan closed with the quiet precision of expensive engineering. From it stepped Arden Vale, a man whose presence rarely required explanation. At 37, he had the calm composure of someone who had built his life carefully, one decision at a time. His charcoal coat fit him with the kind of discipline that suggested both wealth and restraint. Arden Vale owned Valorian, but those who worked for him often said the same thing about their employer. Mr. Vale didn't talk much. He noticed things. That was how he had built everything. Across the street, he adjusted his gloves and began walking toward the restaurant entrance. The cold morning air carried the faint scent of roasted coffee from a nearby cafe and the crisp smell of fallen leaves. At first, the figure near the door registered only as a shape, a small one. Then Arden saw the baby. He slowed. The little girl stood very still, holding the infant in a way that made Arden's attention sharpen instantly. This wasn't the careless grip of a sibling playing house. The child held the baby with deliberate care, one hand supporting the head, the other wrapped protectively around the blanket. The baby let out a weak cry. The girl immediately shifted her weight, rocking gently, as though she had learned long ago how to soothe someone smaller than herself. Arden crossed the sidewalk. Up close, the details became painfully clear. The girl's shoes were scuffed white at the toes. Her sweater was too thin for the weather, and her arms, though trying to remain steady, trembled slightly from the effort of carrying the baby so long. Arden lowered himself slowly until he was kneeling at her eye level. No sudden movement, no loud voice, just presence. The little girl studied him carefully. Children who had known fear learned early that adults had to be read like weather. For a moment she said nothing. Then her lips parted, and the question came out softly, almost confused. "Why did everybody leave us?" The question lingered in the cold morning air, fragile and heavy all at once. For a moment, the city continued moving around them, Cars passing slowly along Beacon Row, footsteps echoing across the pavement, distant conversations drifting from nearby cafes. Yet the small space between the man and the child seemed suddenly separate from everything else. Arden Vale did not answer immediately. He looked at the girl carefully. Her name, he would later learn, was Wren Holloway, but in that moment, she was simply a child standing outside a warm restaurant with a crying baby in her arms and exhaustion in her eyes. Arden noticed the small details first: the faint tremor in her arms, the way she braced the baby's head with practiced care, the way one sleeve of her sweater had been pulled down farther than the other, as if she were hiding something beneath it. Behind him, the restaurant door opened as a staff member prepared to bring in morning deliveries. Arden raised one hand slightly without turning his head. The employee hesitated, then quietly closed the door again. The moment remained undisturbed. Arden finally spoke, his voice calm and steady. "They didn't leave you," he said. Wren blinked, confused. Arden held her gaze, measuring every word carefully. "They failed you." A small gust of wind lifted the edge of the baby's blanket. Arden reached out gently and tucked it back around the infant's shoulders so the cold air wouldn't reach her face. Then he looked back at Wren. "I'm not going to fail you," he said simply. The girl didn't answer. Children who had been disappointed too many times rarely rushed to believe promises, but she didn't step away either. Arden stood slowly and opened the restaurant door. Warm light spilled across the sidewalk. "You can come inside," he said. Wren hesitated, then holding the baby a little tighter, she took one careful step forward and crossed the threshold into a world she had never expected to enter. Wren stopped at the threshold of the restaurant, as if an invisible line separated two different worlds. Behind her lay the cold sidewalk, the rushing city, and the quiet indifference of strangers. Ahead of her, warm golden light spilled across polished wooden floors and tables dressed in white linen. The soft chime of the door rang when Arden opened it wider. Wren flinched instantly. It wasn't dramatic, just a quick tightening of her shoulders, the reflex of a child who had learned to expect sudden punishment when doors opened. Arden noticed. Inside, the restaurant smelled like fresh bread and roasted herbs. The warmth wrapped around them, immediately melting the chill that had clung to Wren's thin sweater. Ivy stirred weakly in her arms, her tiny face pressing against the blanket. Several employees froze mid-step. They had expected a normal morning. Instead, they were staring at a 5-year-old girl holding a baby, as if she had been carrying the weight of the world alone. Arden's voice broke the silence. "Private room," he said calmly. The staff moved without hesitation. Mara Solis, the restaurant's longtime manager, stepped forward first. She had raised 2 children of her own and recognized hunger the moment she saw it. Within seconds, a small dining room near the back was cleared. Wren walked carefully across the floor, her shoes barely making a sound. Her eyes moved slowly around the restaurant. The shining glasses, the tall windows, the soft lighting, as though she had stepped inside a place she was never meant to enter. When she reached the table, she sat down cautiously. Ivy whimpered again. Wren adjusted the baby's blanket with gentle hands, rocking her slightly. A bowl of soup and fresh bread were placed on the table, but Wren didn't reach for them. Instead, she wrapped both arms around Ivy and held her a little tighter, watching every adult in the room with the quiet caution of someone waiting for kindness to disappear. Arden stood near the window while Wren sat at the table, Ivy resting in her lap. The baby had grown quiet for the moment, though her breathing carried the tired rhythm of a child who had cried far too often. On the table in front of Wren sat a small bowl of warm soup, a slice of bread, and a glass of water. None of it had been touched. Arden had seen that before. Children who had lived too long with uncertainty sometimes treated food like a trap. He walked toward the sideboard and poured a little warm water into a small glass. Not too full. Small details mattered. He placed it near Wren, but not directly in front of her. No pressure, just presence. Across the room, Mara watched quietly. She understood something about hunger that many people didn't. Real hunger changed the way a child moved around food. Wren's hands were not reaching for the bowl. They were gripping Ivy. The baby stirred and let out a weak cry. "You can put her down if your arms hurt," Arden said gently. Wren shook her head immediately. "No." The word came out too fast. Arden nodded once, accepting the answer. Just then, Mara stepped closer with a folded blanket. "Thought this might help," she said softly. Wren studied her carefully as Mara placed the blanket beside Ivy and stepped back, giving the child space. As Wren adjusted the baby's blanket, the sleeve of her sweater slid up slightly. Arden saw it. A bruise on her wrist. Another mark higher along her arm, darker, older. Different colors. Different days. Arden's expression didn't change, but something inside his calm shifted. He had built an empire by recognizing patterns other people ignored, and he knew exactly what those marks meant. A gentle knock sounded on the door. Mara stepped aside as Dr. Eliza Rowan entered the room carrying a small medical case. She moved with the steady confidence of someone used to quiet emergencies, fainting guests, allergic reactions, the kinds of situations wealthy places preferred, handled discreetly. But the moment she saw Wren holding the baby, her expression softened. The doctor in her eyes took over. She crouched slowly so she was level with the child. "Hi there," she said gently. "My name's Eliza." Wren didn't answer. Her eyes flicked toward Arden. Children in unfamiliar situations often searched for the safest face in the room. Arden gave a small, reassuring nod. Dr. Rowan opened her case and removed a small flashlight. "I'm just going to check a few things," she explained softly. "Is that all right?" After a moment, Wren nodded once. Eliza began with the baby. She checked Ivy's breathing, her pulse, her temperature. The baby's body felt lighter than it should for her age. Her arms were thin beneath the blanket. Eliza kept her voice calm, but her mind was already working quickly. Then she turned to Wren. "May I see your arm?" she asked. Wren hesitated, then slowly pushed back the sleeve of her sweater. More bruises, some faded yellow, some dark purple. Marks that didn't belong to accidents. Each time Eliza moved too quickly, Wren flinched slightly. Eliza slowed down even more. When the examination finished, she stood and walked quietly toward Arden. Her voice dropped low. "This isn't neglect," she said. Arden already knew. Eliza continued steady and certain. "This child has been hurt repeatedly." Across the room, Wren sat silently with Ivy in her arms, watching the adults carefully, waiting. Because in her experience, kindness never stayed very long. The small private dining room inside Valorian had been designed for quiet conversations between wealthy guests. But that morning, it held something far more fragile. A 5-year-old girl and a hungry baby. The bowl of soup on the table sent up thin curls of steam. Fresh bread rested beside it, still warm from the kitchen. The smell alone would have made most people reach for it immediately. But Wren did not move. She sat stiffly in the chair with Ivy in her arms, watching every adult in the room, the way small animals watch unfamiliar hands. Arden pulled out the chair across from her and sat down slowly. "You can eat," he said gently. Wren looked down at the table. For several long seconds, she didn't respond. Then she asked a question that made the entire room fall silent. "Can she eat first?" Her voice was barely louder than the hum of the air conditioner. Arden leaned forward slightly. "You mean Ivy?" Wren nodded quickly. "She's hungrier." Dr. Rowan stepped forward with a small bottle she had just warmed. "I have something for her," she said softly. Wren took the bottle carefully with both hands and tilted it toward Ivy's mouth. The baby began to drink. Only then did Wren relax the tiniest amount. Across the room, Mara watched the scene with folded arms and shining eyes. She had seen hungry children before, but something about the quiet determination in Wren's small movements made her chest tighten. After Ivy drank for several minutes, Wren finally reached for the bread, but she didn't eat it. She tore it into small pieces. One piece she placed beside the soup, another piece she slipped quietly into the pocket of her sweater. Arden noticed. She wasn't eating, she was saving food. He gently slid the bread basket closer to her. "There's plenty," he said softly. Wren froze. Children who had grown up with scarcity rarely believed in abundance. Finally, she took a small bite. Slow, careful, as if the food might disappear if she ate too quickly. A loud clatter echoed from the kitchen. Somewhere down the hallway, a metal pan slipped from someone's hands and hit the floor. The sharp sound rang through the restaurant. Wren reacted instantly. Her entire body jerked, and the chair legs scraped loudly against the floor as she flinched backward. Ivy startled in her arms and began to cry. "I'm sorry," Wren blurted out quickly. The apology came so fast it sounded like breathing. Mara's eyes softened with sudden understanding. That was not the reaction of a shy child. That was the reaction of someone who had learned that loud noises were often followed by punishment. Arden leaned forward. "You didn't do anything wrong," he said quietly. Wren didn't answer. She rocked Ivy gently, whispering soft words meant only for the baby until the crying stopped. Dr. Rowan knelt beside the table again. "Wren," she said gently, "can you tell us who takes care of you?" And Ivy Wren kept her eyes on the table. "Our guardian. What's his name?" The pause was small, but everyone in the room felt it. Finally, she whispered, "Silas." "Silas what?" Dr. Rowan asked. Wren shrugged. "Just Silas." Arden noticed how quickly the answers came after that. "Yes, he's probably looking for us. Yes, we got lost. Yes, everything is okay." The sentences sounded too smooth, too practiced. Arden had spent years negotiating business deals. He knew what rehearsed answers sounded like. He also noticed something else. Every time someone moved closer to the table, Wren shifted her body slightly so that Ivy was shielded behind her arms. Protective positioning, instinctive, learned. Arden rested his hands on the table and spoke calmly. "No one here is going to take your sister from you." Wren looked up slowly. Her eyes studied his face carefully. For the first time since she entered the restaurant, her grip around the baby loosened just a little. Dr. Rowan asked another question carefully. "Does Silas ever hurt you?" Wren didn't answer. Her eyes dropped back to the table. The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. Across the room, Mara held her breath. Then Wren spoke very softly. "He gets mad." Arden leaned forward slightly. "What happens when he gets mad?" Wren's shoulders tightened. She shook her head quickly. "It's okay." Dr. Rowan kept her voice gentle. "You're safe here." Wren looked up again, uncertainty flickering across her face. For a moment it seemed like she might say more. Instead, she whispered something else. "Silas says we're lucky." Arden felt something tighten in his chest. Lucky, a word often used by people who held power over someone smaller. Dr. Rowan asked quietly, lucky, how Wren stared down at Ivy. Her fingers stroked the baby's tiny hand. When she spoke again, her voice was so soft, the adults almost missed it. "He says, kids like us should be quiet." Another pause. Then the sentence that made the room feel colder. "He says we're worth more quiet." The words settled into the air like frost. Arden didn't move, but the pattern had become unmistakable. Across the table, Wren hugged Ivy closer, unaware that the adults around her had just uncovered something far darker than simple neglect. This was control, silence, fear. And somewhere in the city, a man named Silas was going to realize that the two little girls he thought he owned had just stepped into the one place where someone powerful had finally noticed them. The lunch hour at Valorian had not yet begun, but the restaurant was already humming quietly with preparation. Staff moved through the kitchen with the practiced rhythm that Arden Vale had built into the place over years, measured, efficient calm. Inside the private dining room, however, the calm felt different, more watchful. Wren had finally eaten a few small bites of soup, not quickly, carefully, as though she still half expected someone to take the bowl away. Ivy slept now, curled against Wren's chest beneath the blanket Mara had brought. The baby's breathing had grown steadier, though Dr. Rowan still watched her with professional concern. Arden stood near the window, arms loosely folded, studying the street below. Patterns. Everything in Arden's life came down to patterns. And something about this situation felt incomplete. Children who ran from danger rarely arrived with nothing. They carried something, a toy, a note, a scrap of paper, anything that represented the last piece of their previous life. Across the room, Mara noticed the small coat Wren had taken off earlier and draped over the chair. Mara had raised 2 children. She knew that kids hid things in pockets, the way adults hid things in locked drawers. "Wren," she said gently, "is it all right if I check your coat? Sometimes important things get tucked away in pockets." Wren hesitated. Then she nodded. Mara reached carefully into the first pocket. Nothing but a crumpled napkin. She checked the second. Her fingers brushed against folded paper. Slowly, she pulled out an envelope. The paper was worn and creased as if it had been opened many times. Mara unfolded it and scanned the page. Her expression changed. "Arden," she said quietly. He crossed the room. The document was an insurance statement. 2 names appeared near the top. Daniel Holloway, Clara Holloway, status deceased below. That was another line. Beneficiaries Wren Holloway and Ivy Holloway. Arden's eyes moved down the page. Then he saw the final line. Custodian of funds for minor beneficiaries, Silas Creed. Arden looked up slowly. Across the table, Wren was gently rocking Ivy again, unaware that the adults around her had just discovered the real reason someone might want 2 small girls to stay quiet. The room remained quiet for several seconds after Arden finished reading the document. Dr. Rowan stepped closer. "Life insurance," Arden nodded once. "For their parents." Mara crossed her arms slowly, anger flickering behind her eyes. "So the money belongs to the girls?" "Yes," said a new voice from the doorway. Everyone turned. Vivian Cross entered the room with the calm confidence of someone accustomed to complicated problems. Arden's attorney rarely appeared without reason, and the moment Mara had mentioned the document, Arden had already asked for her to come. Vivian took the paper from his hand and read quickly. "Custodial financial control," she said. Arden's expression remained still. "Meaning?" he asked. Vivian folded the document neatly. "It means the inheritance legally belongs to the girls," she explained. "But until they reach adulthood, their guardian controls how that money is used." Mara understood immediately. "So he gets access to it." Vivian shook her head slightly, not directly. Then she paused. "But he decides how it's spent." The implications settled heavily into the room. Dr. Rowan spoke quietly. He could starve them and still claim the money is being used for their care. Vivian nodded. "And if anything happened to the children before they became adults," she added carefully, "the legal situation surrounding the funds could become complicated." Arden finished the thought. "And the money remains under his control longer." Across the table, Wren continued feeding Ivy with small, patient movements, completely unaware that the adults had just uncovered the financial motive behind her suffering. Arden stepped back toward the window and pulled out his phone. Vivian watched him carefully. "You're thinking about next steps," she said. "Yes." "What are you planning?" Arden looked back at the small girl holding her sister. His voice was calm. "Protection first." He typed a message and sent it. 3 words. "Emergency custody filing." Then he dialed another number. When the call connected, Arden spoke quietly. "Nolan," he said. On the other end of the line, Detective Nolan Pierce answered. What's going on? Arden looked across the room at Ren. I think two children just escaped someone who has been using them like assets. Across the street from Valorian, the city continued moving through its ordinary day. People hurried past storefronts. Taxi horns echoed down the avenue. The quiet drama unfolding inside the restaurant remained invisible to most of Boston. But one person had noticed something earlier that morning. A young woman sitting in a nearby cafe had seen the small girl standing outside Valorian with a crying baby in her arms. The image had stayed with her. She had filmed a short video. Nothing dramatic, just a child standing in the cold, rocking a baby gently while people walked past. After a moment of hesitation, she posted it online with a simple caption. This broke my heart. Within minutes, the video began spreading. Comments appeared. People shared it. Some asked if anyone had helped the girl. Others wondered where the child's parents were. None of them realized how quickly the video would reach the one person who should never have seen it. Across the city, in a dim apartment cluttered with unopened mail and empty bottles, a man sat on a worn leather couch, scrolling through his phone. Silas Creed. His thumb stopped suddenly. The video replayed. A small girl. A baby. The sign above the restaurant entrance clearly visible behind them. Valorian Silas sat up slowly. The softness in his face disappeared. He replayed the video again, zooming in on the girl's face. Ren. His jaw tightened. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he stood. Silas was not the kind of man who shouted when he was angry. His anger moved differently. Quiet. Precise. The way predators moved when prey wandered somewhere it was not supposed to go. Back at Valorian, Arden ended his call with Detective Pierce. Vivian had already begun assembling legal documents. Dr. Rowan continued checking Ivy's breathing. Ren sat quietly at the table. Then Arden's phone vibrated. Unknown number. He answered calmly. Arden Vale. For a moment there was only breathing on the other end. Then a smooth voice spoke. Mr. Vale. Arden's eyes narrowed slightly. My name, the man said pleasantly, is Silas Creed. Across the room, Ren's head lifted instantly. Even from several feet away, the sound of that name moved through her like electricity. Silas continued. I believe you may have something that belongs to me. The moment the call ended, the air inside the private dining room changed. Not visibly, not all at once, but like the pressure drop before a storm, everyone felt it. Ren froze in her chair, Ivy still in her arms. The little girl's fingers tightened around the baby's blanket until her knuckles turned pale. Her breathing changed first quicker, shallower, and Arden noticed that before he noticed anything else. Ren, he said gently, keeping his voice low and level. He can't come near you here. She didn't answer. Children who had lived under fear for too long did not trust reassurance simply because it sounded kind. They trusted patterns. They trusted what happened next. Vivian Cross had already spread the insurance papers, legal forms, and temporary custody notes across the sideboard. Her mind was moving several steps ahead, calculating possibilities, anticipating claims, building the paper wall that men like Silas Creed always seemed to exploit and hide behind. Mara Solis stood by the door with her arms folded tightly across her chest. She had spent years managing wealthy guests, powerful egos, and public scenes disguised as private ones. But this was different. Her instincts were not managerial now. They were maternal, protective, sharp. Dr. Eliza Rowan remained close to Ren and Ivy, pretending to reorganize her medical case while keeping one eye on the child and the other on the hallway. Ivy had finished her bottle and drifted into a weak but peaceful sleep. Her tiny mouth parted slightly against Ren's sweater. Arden stepped aside and called Detective Nolan Pierce again. He knows where they are, Arden said. On the other end, Pierce's voice hardened instantly. Keep him talking if he calls back. I'm sending officers to stand by. I don't want a public circus. Then don't let him force one, Pierce replied. But if he walks in there claiming legal guardianship, you need witnesses, documentation, and restraint. Men like this count on looking more reasonable than the people trying to stop them. Arden's gaze moved to Wren, a 5-year-old girl with healing bruises on her arms and terror in her eyes. Reasonable had already failed her once. 22 minutes later, the front door of Valorian opened. The familiar soft chime echoed through the restaurant. Wren flinched so violently, the spoon on the table rattled. Lunch service had begun by then. A few early guests sat near the windows speaking in low, elegant tones over coffee and sparkling water. The restaurant still glowed with controlled, beauty-polished silverware, amber light, smooth music drifting through the air. Wealth liked calm. It paid for calm. Then Silas Creed walked through the door. He wore a tailored charcoal coat, neatly combed hair, and the expression of a worried guardian doing everything he could to remain composed. That was what made him dangerous. Nothing about him looked reckless. Nothing about him looked cruel. Men like Silas survived because they understood that the world trusted a clean collar more than a frightened child. He paused just inside the entrance and took in the room with one smooth glance. Then his eyes found Wren. She shrank inward immediately, not dramatically, not loudly. But the smallness of her body changed, folding tighter around Ivy as though instinct had taken control and ordered her to become less visible. Silas smiled. "There they are," he said warmly. Several diners looked up. Arden moved before Silas could take another step. He placed himself squarely between the man and the hallway leading to the private room. Not aggressive, not theatrical, just immovable. Silas stopped. For a moment the two men said nothing. Then Silas extended one hand politely, as though arriving for a business introduction, instead of a confrontation over two abused children. "Mr. Vale, I assume." Arden did not take the hand. "And you're Silas Creed." Silas let the hand fall back to his side with a faint, almost amused breath. "I'm relieved you answered my call. I've been looking for my nieces all morning. They've had a very upsetting day." Behind Arden, Wren lowered her head. One small tear slid down her cheek, though she made no sound. Silas noticed. Of course he noticed. Predators always did. He lifted his voice just enough for the nearby tables to hear. "These girls are confused," he said with heartbreaking patience, performing concern for the room. "Their parents died recently. They wander sometimes when they're frightened. I'm simply here to take them home." The lie was elegant. That made it worse. Arden's reply came quiet and flat. "No." Silas blinked once, as if surprised by resistance from a stranger. "Excuse me," Arden held his gaze. "You will not approach them." A hush moved through the dining room. Even the waitstaff seemed to slow. A woman near the window lowered her coffee cup halfway to the saucer and did not set it down. Silas's expression remained controlled, but something colder flickered underneath. "I think you misunderstand the situation," he said. "I am their legal guardian." Vivian Cross stepped into view, then one hand holding a folder. "Temporary protective proceedings are already underway." Silas turned his head slightly toward her. "And you are counsel," she said. Dr. Rowan appeared just behind Wren's chair, calm and composed. Mara stood at the corridor entrance like a wall. Silas looked from one face to the next. He had expected kindness to be soft. He had not expected it to organize, and for the first time since entering his smile thinned at the edges. The silence in Valorian felt expensive and fragile, the kind that usually existed before a toast or a proposal, not before a child abuser lost control of a room. Silas understood audiences. Arden could see that immediately. He shifted his posture just slightly enough to appear less confrontational and more wounded. He lowered his shoulders, softened his mouth, and gave the room the expression of a man trying to remain patient, while strangers complicated a family matter. It was a good performance. That was the problem. These girls, Silas said, turning partly toward the diners, as if unwilling witnesses might become his allies, have suffered a terrible loss. They are frightened and confused. Mr. Vale clearly meant well, but he doesn't understand their history. Wren's breathing quickened. Arden heard it from several feet away. Silas took one careful step toward the back corridor. Arden moved at the exact same moment, blocking the path with such calm precision that it felt less like aggression than architecture. Silas stopped again. Now only a few feet separated them. Up close, the difference between the two men was stark. Arden's restraint came from discipline. Silas's restraint came from calculation. One was holding the line. The other was measuring how best to cross it without looking guilty. "You don't want to do this in public," Silas murmured just loud enough for Arden to hear. Arden's answer was equally quiet. "You already did." A murmur passed through the nearest tables. Someone lifted a phone discreetly. Another person pretended not to watch while clearly watching everything. Silas noticed the shift in attention and adapted instantly. He let out a small, weary exhale and said, "Mr. Vale, I appreciate your concern, but these girls belong with family." Arden's eyes darkened. The word belong hung in the air like poison. Belong, as though Wren and Ivy were not children, but possessions returned to their rightful owner. Silas misread the silence as hesitation and pushed further. "They belong with me," he said. What happened next would later become the line people remembered most. Arden stepped forward half a pace enough to make clear that the conversation had ended and the boundary had not. "Children," he said, each word controlled, "do not belong to anyone." The sentence landed through the restaurant with the force of a dropped blade. A woman near the bar covered her mouth. A man by the window lowered his phone and then lifted it again, no longer bothering to hide the fact that he was recording. Silas's face changed. Not much. Not enough for anyone unfamiliar with him to name it. But the Polish cracked for half a second, exposing irritation beneath the concern. He turned his head toward Wren. That was when Arden saw something he would never forget. Silas did not look at her like a guardian. He looked at her like a locked account he was about to lose access to. Wren pressed herself tighter around Ivy. "Wren," Silas said softly, and the softness was somehow crueler than anger. "Come here." The little girl did not move. Her chin trembled once. Marasolis stepped closer behind her. Dr. Rowan kept one hand near the back of Wren's chair, not touching, just letting the child feel the presence of protection without force. Vivian Cross opened her folder. "You may want to stop speaking as though these children are objects under your management," she said coolly. "Especially with a room full of witnesses and law enforcement on the way." Silas's gaze flicked toward her. "You seem very sure of yourself." Vivian gave him a look so clean and cold it almost felt surgical. "I am." He tried a different tone, then injured paternal disappointed. "To be clear," he said, "for the room's benefit, I came here peacefully. I came to retrieve 2 grieving children who ran from home after becoming upset. And now I'm being publicly accused by strangers who do not know my family." The lie was smoother than before, almost beautiful in its construction. Arden wondered how many times Silas had used polished language to erase what happened behind closed doors. Then Wren did something small and devastating. At the sound of the word home, she whispered, "Please no." She hadn't meant to say it aloud. The room heard her anyway. Silas's expression froze for one fatal instant. Not because he cared, she was afraid. Because she had spoken in front of witnesses. Arden turned slightly, just enough to shield Wren from his line of sight. Then he said, with the calm of final warning, "You are finished here." Silas smiled again, but the smile had gone hollow. "No," he said quietly. "I don't think I am." And that was the exact moment Detective Nolan Pierce walked through the door. Detective Nolan Pierce entered Valorian with the kind of quiet authority that never needed to announce itself. Two uniformed officers came in behind him, not rushing, not grandstanding, just steady men stepping into a room where civility had already become camouflage. Silas heard the door chime and turned. If he was surprised, he hid it well. Pierce approached at an unhurried pace, his coat still open from the cold outside badge visible at his belt. He had the face of a man who had spent too many years watching lies try to dress themselves as concern. His eyes moved first to Arden, then to Wren, then to the baby, then finally to Silas. "Silas Creed," he said. Silas gave a faint, restrained smile. "Detective." So they knew each other by type, if not by history. Men like Silas often left small shadows in enough places to become familiar to police. Pierce stopped a few feet away. "I'm told there's a dispute involving two minors." "There's no dispute," Silas replied smoothly. "Only a misunderstanding inflamed by wealthy people with a savior complex." The insult was elegant enough to sound almost reasonable. Pierce did not react. That's one version. Vivian Cross stepped forward and handed the detective a slim stack of documents, medical notes from Dr. Rowan, initial photographs of bruising, the insurance statement naming Silas custodian of the girls' funds, and the first pages of the emergency custody filing. Pierce scanned only enough to understand the shape of the matter. His jaw tightened almost invisibly. Then he looked toward Wren. A 5-year-old child sat rigid in a velvet dining chair, arms locked around an underfed baby, eyes fixed on the floor, as if looking too high might bring disaster down on her head. That image said more than any statement in the room. Silas noticed the detective's attention and changed strategy immediately. He lowered his voice and softened his face. "Wren," he said, "sweetheart, come on. You've had a long morning. Let's go home." Wren didn't move. Pierce noticed that too. Arden noticed something else. Silas had angled his body just enough that his voice reached Wren more clearly than anyone else. The tone sounded gentle to outsiders, but the little girl's hands started to shake. Then, while Pierce glanced at Vivian's paperwork and one officer shifted position near the entry, Silas leaned ever so slightly toward Wren and murmured something so low it could have been mistaken for reassurance. Only Arden, Mara, and Wren saw the effect. Wren went white. Her fingers tightened violently around Ivy's blanket. The baby stirred and gave a frightened little cry. Wren immediately bent over her sister, as though shielding her from an incoming blow. Arden's voice came cold. "What did you say to her?" Silas straightened, all innocence. "I told her it's all right." "No," Arden said. "You didn't." Pierce looked up sharply. "What happened?" Wren kept her eyes down. Her mouth trembled. No sound came out. Mara crouched beside her chair and whispered, "Sweetheart, you're safe." But safety for children like Wren was not a sentence. It was a test that had to survive the next 5 minutes. Pierce stepped closer to Silas. "Did you communicate with the child after being told not to approach?" Silas gave a quiet laugh of disbelief. "She's 5. I spoke kindly to her." "Is that a crime?" Now Arden's restraint was becoming something harder to maintain. "What did you say?" he asked Wren gently. The room seemed to lean in. Wren swallowed. Her voice, when it came, was barely audible. He said. She stopped. Pierce waited. Wren tried again, her little body shaking with the effort. He said, "If I don't come home, somebody else will pay for it." The dining room went completely still. No clinking glasses, no rustle of coats, no soft music anyone could hear anymore. Even the kitchen seemed to disappear. Silas's expression did not collapse. That was the frightening part. He simply looked annoyed that she had repeated it. Pierce's voice dropped into something dangerous and official. "Officer, note that." One of the uniforms lifted a pen immediately. Silas spread his hands as though injured by the accusation. "This is absurd. The child is frightened. She misunderstood." Pierce said. "Children do misunderstand many things. Terror usually isn't one of them." Silas's smile vanished. only for a second. Then it returned thinner, now stripped of warmth. "Be careful, detective," he said quietly. "You're turning a family dispute into a legal liability." Pierce looked at him without blinking. "Funny," he replied. "I was just thinking the same about you." Silas glanced once more toward Wren, and this time Arden stepped fully into that line of sight. A wall, a verdict, a promise made visible. Silas had come to retrieve what he believed was his. Instead, he had whispered a threat in a room finally full of people who knew exactly what they were looking at. And now the story was no longer about whether Wren and Ivy needed protection. It was about how far Silas Creed would go before the law closed around him. Night fell slowly over Boston, and with it came a quiet kind of caution. After the confrontation at Valorian, Detective Nolan Pierce had insisted on one thing: the girls could not stay anywhere predictable until the emergency custody hearing began. Men like Silas don't lose control quietly, he had warned. So Arden Vale did what he always did when facing uncertainty. He prepared. Less than an hour after the restaurant closed early, a second car pulled away from the back entrance of Valorian. The route wound through side streets and quiet neighborhoods, avoiding the wide boulevards where someone might easily follow. Finally, the car turned onto a narrow, tree-lined road on the edge of the city. Arden's townhouse stood at the end of it. It wasn't the largest home he owned. In fact, compared to his other properties, it was modest. But it had something more important than luxury: privacy. Tall maple trees surrounded the property. A long driveway curved toward a warm porch light. Security cameras watched the quiet street from angles most people would never notice. When the car stopped, Mara stepped out first. Arden opened the back door. Wren hesitated before stepping onto the driveway. Her eyes moved slowly across the house, studying every window, every shadow, every corner of the porch. Children who had lived with danger rarely trusted new places quickly. "You can bring Ivy inside," Arden said gently. Wren nodded. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cedar and lavender. Arden had prepared the room quickly: a small bed with fresh white sheets, a crib placed beside the window, and a soft nightlight glowing faintly against the wall. Nothing extravagant, just safe. Wren carried Ivy to the crib and laid her down with extraordinary care, adjusting the blanket 3 times before stepping back. Then she did something Arden hadn't expected. Instead of climbing into the bed, Wren sat down on the floor beside the crib, guarding it. Arden leaned quietly against the doorway, watching the small girl with the exhausted determination of someone who believed sleep was dangerous. "You can rest," he said softly. Wren shook her head. "I have to watch her." For a long moment, Arden didn't answer. Then he sat down on the floor across from her, not above her, beside her. Hours passed. The house settled into the kind of quiet that only comes after a long day filled with too many emotions. Upstairs, Wren finally climbed onto the bed, though she kept one hand resting against the crib where Ivy slept. Even in sleep, her body leaned slightly toward the baby, as though she were ready to wake at the smallest sound. Downstairs, Arden sat at the kitchen table. Papers covered the surface: insurance statements, medical reports, legal documents Vivian had already begun preparing. The pattern had become painfully clear. Silas Creed had never wanted guardianship because he loved the girls. He wanted control of the money attached to them. Arden rubbed his temples. For the first time all day, exhaustion threatened to break through his composure. Then his phone buzzed softly. Security alert. Movement detected at the front gate. Arden stood immediately and walked to the living room window. Outside, beneath a dim street lamp, a dark sedan sat parked across from the property. The engine idled quietly. After several seconds, the driver's door opened. A man stepped out. Even from that distance, Arden recognized the posture: relaxed, patient, watchful. Silas Creed. He leaned casually against the car for a moment, his gaze fixed on the house beyond the gate. Not shouting, not approaching, just waiting. The message was clear. I know where you are. Arden's jaw tightened. Silas eventually climbed back into the car and drove away, disappearing down the quiet street, as though he had never been there at all. But the message had already been delivered. Upstairs, Wren stirred in her sleep. Perhaps she felt it too. Somewhere deep in her memory, the part of her that had learned to recognize danger before it arrived was already awake. And Arden understood something important as he stood in the dark living room. Silas Creed wasn't finished. He was simply choosing his next move. Morning arrived softly. Golden sunlight filtered through the maple trees surrounding Arden's house, scattering across the lawn like quiet reflections. Inside the kitchen, the smell of coffee drifted through the hall while Mara prepared breakfast with the same calm rhythm she used at Valorian. Upstairs, Wren sat on the edge of the bed. She had been awake for a long time. Ivy still slept peacefully in the crib beside the window, one tiny hand resting above the blanket. Every few seconds, Wren glanced at the baby to make sure she was still breathing. Old habits. Downstairs, Arden reviewed the legal documents Vivian had sent overnight. Temporary custody filings, medical statements, financial records connecting Silas to the insurance money. The case was building quickly, but Arden knew something Vivian had warned him about. Men like Silas rarely surrendered control easily. A sound interrupted his thoughts. The soft creak of the front gate. Arden looked up. The security monitor on the wall flickered to life. A man stood outside the gate holding a clipboard. Gray coat, neatly trimmed hair. A badge clipped to his pocket. Arden's eyes narrowed. The intercom buzzed. "Good morning," the man said politely through the speaker. "This is Silas Creed, court-appointed welfare officer." Upstairs, Wren heard the voice through the hallway speaker. Her body went completely still. She stepped slowly toward the window. Outside the gate stood the man she knew better than anyone. Silas looked up at the house. Even from a distance, Wren recognized the faint smile on his face. He raised one hand and gestured toward the gate. "Come here." Downstairs, Arden leaned closer to the intercom. "Name the agency," he said calmly. "Give me the case number and the supervisor who sent you." Outside, Silas's smile held just a little too long. A real officer would have answered immediately. A liar had to choose his words. And Arden had already made his decision. He wasn't opening that gate. Silas waited outside the gate with the calm patience of someone who believed he still controlled the situation. The gray clipboard rested casually against his arm. The fake badge on his coat glinted in the morning light. To anyone driving past, he looked like a routine government worker performing a simple welfare check. Inside the house, the silence was tense. Upstairs, Wren stood frozen beside Ivy's crib. Her heart beat so loudly she could hear it in her ears. When Silas raised his hand toward the gate, the old fear surged through her chest, like a storm she could not escape. Downstairs, Arden remained at the intercom. "Name the agency," he repeated calmly. Outside, Silas smiled thinly. "Mr. Vale," he said, voice smooth through the speaker, "refusing a welfare inspection could become a legal problem for you." Arden did not move toward the lock. Instead, he said quietly, "Detective Pierce." At that moment, the side door opened. Detective Nolan Pierce stepped into the hallway with two officers behind him. The plan had already been set in motion the moment Silas appeared on the camera. Pierce pressed the intercom button. "Silas Creed," he said evenly. "You might want to remove that fake badge before this gets worse." Outside the gate, Silas froze. For the first time that morning, the confidence in his posture cracked. The gate opened slowly. The officers stepped forward. Silas tried one final performance. "She came to me willingly," he said loudly, pointing toward the house. "Ask the girl." Inside the doorway, Wren stood trembling with Ivy in her arms. The yard fell silent. For years, Silas had controlled her voice with fear, but now the whole world seemed to be waiting. and Wren finally spoke. He said Mr. Vale would get in trouble if I didn't come. The officers exchanged a glance. The performance was over. Detective Pierce didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Instead, he lifted a small recording device clipped to his jacket and pressed a button. Silas's own voice played softly through the quiet yard. "If you don't bring the baby to me right now." The rest of the threat echoed clearly through the morning air. Silas's shoulders stiffened. Pierce switched off the recording. "You impersonated a welfare officer," the detective said calmly. "You threatened a minor. And we already have medical evidence connected to abuse allegations." Silas's expression hardened. "You're making a mistake," he snapped. Pierce shook his head. "No," he replied quietly. "You already did." The officers stepped forward. For a moment, Silas looked past them toward the house. His eyes locked onto Wren. The polite mask he had worn all morning finally vanished, replaced by the cold anger she remembered too well. Wren shrank slightly. Arden stepped forward, immediately blocking Silas's view. The officers guided Silas toward the patrol car waiting outside the gate. His protests grew louder, but the performance no longer worked. The evidence was too clear. The car door slammed shut. The engine started. And for the first time in years, the man who had controlled Wren's life disappeared down the street without the power to call her back. The house fell quiet again. Wren stood in the doorway, clutching Ivy. Arden knelt beside her. "It's over for today," he said gently. Wren looked up at him carefully. Children who had lived with fear rarely believed safety right away, but something in Arden's voice had remained steady from the moment they met, and slowly Wren nodded. The weeks that followed moved slowly, not dramatically. Real healing rarely looked dramatic. Dr. Rowan continued monitoring the girl's recovery. Ivy gained weight with regular meals and sleep. The baby's cries grew stronger, healthier. Wren changed more gradually. The bruises on her arms faded first, then the shadows beneath her eyes. Later came the harder things. Learning that loud noises in the kitchen did not mean punishment, learning that doors could open without someone yelling, learning that adults could keep promises. Vivian Cross built the legal case piece by piece. Medical records, financial documents, witness statements from Valorian. Within months, the court terminated Silas Creed's guardianship permanently. The inheritance was placed under legal protection until the girls reached adulthood. But the most important change happened quietly. One evening, nearly 2 years later, Valorian closed early. Not for an event. For dinner. Arden sat at the kitchen table with 2 small guests who now knew the house as home. Ivy, now a toddler, laughed as she tried to climb onto a chair too tall for her legs. Wren sat beside Arden, drawing on a piece of paper with careful concentration. 3 stick figures beneath a bright yellow sun. When she finished, she slid the drawing toward him. Then she asked the question that had once broken his heart. "So, you didn't leave us?" Arden looked at the picture, then at the little girl beside him. He squeezed her hand gently. "No, sweetheart," he said. "I stayed." And this time Wren believed him. Did this story leave a lasting impression on you? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment, rate it from 1 to 10, and tap the end screen to see another heartwarming story waiting for you. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, then tap the bell icon so you don't miss any new stories. Until our next